Montana Territory, December 1881. The storm had been blowing since dawn, but it was near dusk when Xavier Tolan spotted the shape in the snow. He reined in his mare so fast she danced sideways, snorting at the wind. He narrowed his eyes. It was not an animal. It was a woman, bare arms, no coat, half buried in a drift. "God Almighty," he muttered, already off his saddle and sinking to his knees beside her. She was breathing barely. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as fresh milk, lashes crusted with frost. She could not have been out here long or she would have been gone. She looked young, maybe 20. Her hair was dark and tangled, her dress torn near the hem. There was blood on her temple, just a thin line, but enough to twist his gut. He slid his arms beneath her. She was light, too light, and limp as a rag doll. "You are not dying out here," he said under his breath, holding her tight against his chest as he stood. "Not today." The snow stung his face as he mounted back up, the wind howling across the open flats. He wrapped her in his coat and held her steady in front of him, one hand on the reins, the other keeping her close. His cabin was 5 miles west, nestled near a line of pines. He rode hard. By the time he kicked the door open, the girl's head lolled against his shoulder. His own hands were numb, but he moved fast, laying her on the cot near the fire and stoking the flames higher until the room glowed hot and orange. He stripped her wet boots, peeled off the soaked dress, and wrapped her in every wool blanket he had. His jaw clenched when he saw the bruises on her ribs, the scar on her shoulder, the red mark like a handprint on her thigh. He turned away, chest tight, and went to boil water. She woke just after midnight. He had been asleep in the chair by the fire, boots off, rifle close. The sound she made was small, like a bird calling in the dark. He was beside her in a breath. Her eyes fluttered open green, sharp, and wary. "You are safe," he said quietly. "You are in my cabin. I found you outside, passed out in the snow." She stared at him like she was trying to remember where she was, who she was. "What is your name?" he asked. Her lips parted. "Tessa." He nodded once. "I am Xavier." She blinked again, slow. "Did you carry me?" "Yes." Her voice was raw. "Why?" "Because you were dying." She looked at the fire, then at the bandage on her forehead. Her fingers trembled as she touched it. He reached out slow. "You are all right now." Her breath caught when his hand brushed hers, but she did not pull away. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. They sat in silence for a long time, the wind howling outside, the fire snapping. Finally, she said, "I did not think anyone would find me." "I did. You should have left me." "No," he said, "I should not have." She looked at him then, really looked. "Do you live here alone?" "I do." "Why?" He hesitated. "That is a long story." She did not ask again. She just nodded and closed her eyes. He stayed up the rest of the night. By morning, she was stronger. She sat up on her own, ate the broth he made and kept it down. Her hands were still shaking, but her eyes were clearer now. "You were not walking out in a snowstorm for fun," Xavier said as he set a cup of tea beside her. "No," she said, voice low. "I was running." He did not ask from what. He had seen the bruises. Instead, he said, "You can stay here until you decide what you want to do." She looked at him, something raw in her face. "I do not have anywhere else." He nodded once. "Then this is home for now." 2 days passed. She helped him with the firewood, her sleeves rolled up, cheeks red from the cold. She moved slow, still sore, but she did not complain. He caught her watching him once as he chopped wood, eyes soft, and she turned away fast. He found her crying in the barn the third night. She was curled up on a hay bale, her face buried in her hands. He did not speak. He sat beside her and waited. "My husband died 2 years ago," she said finally. "He was kind." Xavier sat still. "After he passed, I had no money. I took work with a man outside Helena. He seemed decent. He did not interrupt. He was not." Her voice cracked. "He said I owed him, that I would work in his saloon, upstairs, that I had no choice." Xavier's jaw went tight. "You did not belong there." She looked at him. "I ran when he was drunk, fell in the snow. I do not remember much after that." "You do not have to remember it," he said. "You are not there anymore." Her eyes filled again. "Why are you being kind to me?" Xavier stood. "Because I want to be." He held out his hand. She looked at it, then took it. She stayed. Weeks passed. The snow melted. Tessa moved easier now. She laughed sometimes, usually when Xavier grumbled at his stubborn mule or burned the stew. She cleaned the little cabin, mended his shirts, planted seeds out back. Xavier built her a dresser. She sewed him a new scarf. One night, sitting on the porch beneath a sky full of stars, she turned to him. "I used to think I would never feel safe again." Xavier looked at her. "And now," she touched his hand. "Now I do." He held her fingers. "Tessa, I do not want you to leave." She smiled. "I do not want to leave." He exhaled, slow. "Then stay, as my wife." Her breath caught. "You mean that?" "I do." She looked into his eyes, and whatever fear she had left melted. "Yes." His mouth met hers, slow, careful, but sure. Her hands came up to his shoulders, and she kissed him back with everything she had. That night he carried her inside. Not because she was weak, but because he wanted to. Because she had come back to life in his arms. Because he loved her. And when he laid her on the bed and called her his wife, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I love you, Xavier." He kissed her again. "And I love you, Tessa." By late March, the ground had softened enough for the creek to run again. The thaw came slow, but steady, revealing patches of last year's earth beneath the melting snow. Tessa stood ankle-deep in mud that morning, dragging a rake through the furrows Xavier had turned 2 days before. Her skirt was tucked up around her knees, pinned with a clothes peg, and she'd tied one of his old handkerchiefs around her hair to keep the wind from tossing it into her face. Xavier watched her from the fence line, one gloved hand resting on the post. She was muttering to herself something about rocks and shallow roots, and he didn't interrupt. She moved with purpose now, each step sure. The bruises had faded. The way she held herself had changed too, like her bones had remembered they belonged to her. "You're planting too close," he said finally, tilting his chin toward the row she'd carved. She looked up, squinting against the morning light. "You said the soil's poor here. I thought if I doubled the seed, it might make up for it." He stepped in beside her, boots sinking into the furrow. "You crowd them, they won't take root proper. Better to trust a few strong ones than overwork the patch." Sounds like a man who's lost a crop or two. More than I'd admit out loud. She grinned and handed him the rake. "Then teach me right." He took it without a word and showed her the right spacing, how to angle the tines so the earth stayed loose but firm. She watched his hands, then mimicked the motion. When she got it right, he nodded once and stepped back. Later, he carried water from the creek while she washed the clothes on the flat stones. Her hands were red from the cold, but she didn't complain. She wrung out his shirt and laid it across the line he'd strung between 2 pine stumps. "Did you ever think you'd marry?" she asked without looking up. He paused, the bucket still in his grip. "Not really." "Why not?" He set the pail down and brushed his palms on his trousers. "Never met the right woman." She stood, arms crossed against the breeze. "You're not what I expected." He stepped closer, voice low. "What did you expect?" Someone harder, she said. Angrier. Men alone out here usually are. I was. She tilted her head. What changed? He looked at her. You were in the snow. I didn't want to be that man anymore. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. In the evenings, she read from the worn Bible that had belonged to his mother. Her voice was steady, and she never skipped the hard verses. He listened while carving new handles for the tools that had worn down to splinters over the winter. Sometimes she'd stop and ask what a word meant, and he'd answer if he knew. If he didn't, he'd admit it plain. One night, she folded the book and rested it on her lap. He used to tell me I was too much trouble to keep. Xavier didn't look up from the piece of hickory he was shaping. He was wrong. She leaned back in the chair, watching the firelight flicker across the beams. I still hear it sometimes. He set the whittling knife down and met her eyes. Let me say it straight, Tessa. You're worth every quiet morning, every hard chore, every single thing I own. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she stood, crossed the room, and knelt beside his chair. Her fingers touched the side of his face, rough with stubble. I need to believe it, she whispered. I'll show you every day until you do. She kissed him, soft and sure, and he held her like she might vanish if he didn't. The next morning, she unpacked the small keepsake box she'd kept buried beneath her things. Inside were a few threadbare letters, a broken brooch, and a pressed daisy she'd once picked near the Missouri River. She placed it on the windowsill where the sun hit mid-morning, then turned back to the hearth without explaining. She didn't need to. He understood. April brought rain, and with it the first green along the edge of the woods. When the sky cleared, they rode out together to check the trap lines. She rode his old gelding, her posture still a little stiff, but her hands sure on the reins. At one point, she turned in the saddle and asked, Do you ever think about leaving this place? He shook his head. This land's the first thing that ever felt like mine. She nodded. Then I'll make it mine, too. That night they sat by the garden plot, watching the clouds roll in from the east. She leaned into his side, her head against his shoulder, and said, I've never been this quiet inside before. He kissed the top of her head. Then let's keep it that way. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. The wind moved through the grass, the sky turned slate, and the world settled around them like it belonged. The first calf came just past midnight, born under a sliver of moon and the hush of early spring thaw. Xavier had been up since sundown with the heifer, his coat soaked and his voice rough from calming her through the labor. When the calf finally dropped into the straw, slick and blinking, he sat back on his heels and let out a breath that fogged in the cold. Tessa stood at the stall gate, lantern in hand, her nightdress tucked under his old canvas duster. Is it all right? He wiped his brow with a sleeve. Strong little bull. Took his time getting here. She stepped closer, eyes on the calf as it struggled to stand. You should sleep. I will. Soon as he's nursing. She set the lantern on a hook and slipped into the stall beside him, crouching beside the mother. Her hands moved careful and sure, brushing straw from the calf's back. He's beautiful. Xavier watched her in the low light, the curve of her face sharp with quiet focus. You were meant for this. She looked up. For what? Peace. The calf found the teat and latched on. Tessa sat back, hands resting on her knees. I used to think I'd die in a place like that saloon, she said, her voice even. Buried in the dark. No one would care. I would've. You didn't know me. I didn't need to. She was quiet for a while, then stood and brushed hay from her skirt. The creek's high, she said, changing the subject. We'll need to check the crossing by the pasture fence. I'll go after breakfast. I'll come too. He gave a small nod. If you do, wear my boots. Yours won't keep the water out. The next morning, they walked the edge of the creek, the rush of meltwater loud against the banks. Xavier prodded a fence post with his boot, testing the looseness. Tessa stood upstream, watching the current carry twigs and bark downstream. "Do you ever think about the war?" she asked, not turning to him. He straightened slowly. "Not much, but it's there. It doesn't go away, just gets quieter." She nodded, eyes still on the water. "My brother never came back from it. He was 17. Rode off with a neighbor's son and never sent word. I'm sorry. My mother never forgave herself for letting him go. She died not long after." He stepped beside her. "You've carried too much. I'm still here. You're not just here, Tessa. You're living." She turned to face him. "You make it feel like I belong somewhere." "You do. Here." They walked back in silence, her hand brushing his once before finding its place in his. That afternoon, Xavier returned from the ridge with a splinter in his palm and a broken harness strap. Tessa poured water into the basin and cleaned the wound with a steady hand, eyes narrowed in concentration. "You don't flinch," he said. "I've seen worse than a splinter. Still, you're good at caring for things." She looked up. "I want to take care of you." "You already do." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "I mean it." He reached for her wrist gently. "Then let me do the same for you." Later that week, she unpacked her sewing things and laid out a length of muslin she'd been saving. She didn't say what it was for, but he caught her measuring the windows, then the pantry shelves. She hummed sometimes, low and tuneless, when she worked. Not a song he knew, maybe one from her childhood, but it settled the cabin like warm bread on the table. One evening, as dusk fell soft and purple across the hills, Xavier brought in a cedar box he'd made and set it beside the hearth. "For you," he said. She opened it to find lengths of calico, a set of shears, and a spool of blue thread. She looked up, eyes wide. "How did you?" "Traded the mule's old bridle and some pelts." Tessa touched the fabric like it might vanish. "I've never had my own sewing box." "You do now." She stepped into his arms, no hesitation, and pressed her face to his chest. "You give me things I never asked for. You give me things I never thought I'd have." Outside, the wind brushed through the pines like a hush. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, and Tessa laid her head on his shoulder as if she'd always belonged there. Xavier wrapped his arms around her and held her close, the quiet between them full of things that didn't need saying. By the tail of May, the wildflowers had crept in along the edge of the pasture, little bursts of blue and yellow threading through the taller grass. Tessa walked out barefoot most mornings now, hem of her skirt lifted just enough to keep from dragging dew. Xavier would watch her from the porch with his coffee, quiet as sunrise, not wanting to disturb the rhythm she'd found in the land. That morning, she returned with a handful of prairie sage and placed it on the table beside the stove. "There's a stand of it blooming just past the south fence," she said. "I thought we could dry some for the pantry." Xavier nodded, setting down his tin cup. "You thinking of making teas? And poultices. My mother used to boil it when we had fevers." He leaned back in the chair, watching her sort the stems. "You never told me where she was born." "Near Fort Scott," she said, not looking up. "She was half Osage. Her parents didn't marry, but she lived with her mother's people until she was 17. Xavier's brow lifted, but he didn't speak. "She taught me how to listen to weather," Tessa went on, "and how to keep a fire steady through the night. Said a woman ought to know how to survive before she ever thought of loving a man." Sounds like she was wise. She was careful. Not the same thing. They worked side by side later that afternoon, reinforcing the chicken pen after a fox had gotten in and carried off one of the hens. The ground was dry enough now to dig without slipping, and they sunk the new stakes deeper than the last ones, packing dirt tight around the base. "Do you ever miss town?" Tessa asked as she handed him another length of wire. He twisted it around the post, pulling it taut with a grunt. "Not sure I ever belonged there. But you lived near one before, didn't you? South of Miles City. Sold timber mostly. Spent more time in the woods than in saloons." She pressed the heel of her boot into the earth. "I always thought if I ever got out of that place, I'd head east. Find a city. Something with books and music in lit windows." "You still could," he said, voice even. "I could," she said. "But I won't." That night, after the animals were fed and the last of the tools hung back in place, Xavier climbed the ladder into the loft and came down with a rolled canvas. He laid it across the table and unwrapped it slow, revealing a set of charcoal drawings, faded but clean. Tessa leaned over the edge of the table, studying them. "You drew these?" He nodded. "Used to when the nights got long." The sketches were of animals: elk, coyotes, a hawk mid-flight, but also people. A girl sitting on a fence rail, a man with his head bowed near a fire. "They're good," she said. "Better than good. I haven't touched them in years." She looked at him. "Why not?" Didn't seem to matter after a while. She touched the drawing of the hawk. "It does now." He didn't answer, but he didn't put them away either. The next morning, she found an empty space cleared near the window, with paper and charcoal set neatly beside it. She didn't speak of it, but he saw the way her hand brushed the edge of the table when she passed. Toward the end of the week, a letter arrived, brought by a ranch hand from a neighboring spread. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the envelope plain. Xavier opened it slowly, reading it once, then again. When he looked up, Tessa was watching from across the room. "It's from the man who used to own the saloon," he said. "He's heard where you are." Her face didn't change. "What does he want?" "He says you took something that belonged to him. He's threatening to come for it." She stepped forward, voice low. "I didn't take anything but my own body." "I know. Will he come?" Xavier folded the letter and set it on the mantel without answering. That night, he oiled his rifle and checked the hinges on the cabin door. Tessa said nothing, but she didn't sleep until he did. By morning, the sky was heavy with cloud, and the wind had shifted east. They didn't speak much over breakfast. She poured his coffee and sat opposite him, hands folded in her lap. "I've lived with fear before," she said. "But I won't let it decide for me." He looked at her across the table. "You won't have to face him alone." "I know." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not something a man owns. You're my wife." Her eyes didn't waver. "And I'll stand beside you, no matter what comes." Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the grass flat. But inside the cabin, their hands stayed linked, steady as the fire burning behind them. 3 days passed without a rider. No dust trails on the ridge, no hoofbeats in the stillness. But Xavier didn't ease the rifle from beside the door, and Tessa didn't walk far from the cabin without him. The air was thick with summer's breath already, though June hadn't turned yet. Bees had begun to gather at the lavender she'd planted along the fence. She noticed them circling low, slow-winged and purposeful, and took it as a good sign. That morning, she stepped into the shed behind the cabin and pulled down the small wooden box her mother had carved years ago. Inside were her few remaining keepsakes, tucked in cloth: a deer tooth, 2 copper buttons, and a strip of woven ribbon with a faded red thread. She ran her finger along the edge of the ribbon, then tied it into her braid before stepping back outside. Xavier was at the chopping block, sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the back of his neck. She crossed the yard, stopped near the rain barrel, and watched him split a log clean through the center. "When this is over," she said, I want to build a bench over by the east fence. He wiped his brow with the crook of his arm. What for? To sit. To see the sky where it opens wide. He nodded once, shoulders easing. We'll build it after the next rain. That night a rider came. The dog barked first, a low growl giving way to sharp warning. Xavier pulled the door open and stepped out, rifle in hand. Tessa stood behind him, her breath steady. The man didn't dismount. He stopped 10 paces from the porch, hat low over his eyes, a revolver resting easy on his hip. You Xavier Tolan? He called. I am. I got a message to deliver. Xavier didn't lower the rifle. You can leave it there on the ground. The man shrugged, reached inside his coat, and pulled out a folded paper. He tossed it down near the well. He won't be coming. Had a change of fortune. Lost the saloon to debt. Had to take a train east. Xavier didn't answer. The man turned his horse. He won't bother her again. He's got bigger troubles now. As the rider disappeared into the pines, Xavier stepped down and picked up the paper. No seal, only a short paragraph scribbled in a clumsy hand confirming what the man had said. He walked back inside, shut the door, and leaned the rifle against the wall. Tessa hadn't moved. It's over. It is. She let out a breath that trembled at the edges but held. I thought I'd feel something when it came. What do you feel? Free. She crossed the room, set her hands on his chest. But not because of him. Because I'm still here. Because I chose this. He drew her close. And I chose you. She didn't answer with words. Her mouth found his warm and certain, and he held her like a man who'd known too much empty space. That week, they began digging the posts for a new fence line to the west. The land there sloped gentle, with enough flat ground for a second pasture. Tessa marked the corners with string, pacing out the stretch with a carpenter's eye. Xavier watched her from the edge of the ridge, admiration plain on his face. You thinking of taking up surveying? He said. I'm thinking we'll need more space if we keep raising calves. Then we'll build it together. On Sunday, they rode into town for supplies. It was the first time they'd gone together. People looked some curious, some cautious, but no one spoke against them. Tessa kept her chin high, her hand looped through Xavier's arm. At the general store, she picked out a bolt of green muslin and a tin of peppermint drops. He bought a new kettle and a scrap of blue ribbon she'd admired without saying so. They returned home by sundown, the light turning gold across the grass. That night, he gave her the ribbon, and she kissed his jaw without a word. By midsummer, the garden had taken root. Beans climbed the trellis. Cucumbers flowered in neat rows. Tessa baked with the first of the rhubarb, setting a pie to cool on the sill while humming a tune neither of them knew. Xavier came in from the fields and caught her dancing barefoot in the kitchen. Flour on her cheek, the hem of her dress caught in the breeze. He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. I could watch you like this for the rest of my life. She turned, smile blooming like the sun through storm cloud. Then do. And he did. They married in August, beneath the cedar tree near the creek. No preacher, just the two of them and the land that had carried them from survival into something more. He wore his best shirt. She wore the ribbon from her hair tied around her wrist. I've carried every hard thing I ever lived, she said, hands in his. But when I look at you, I don't feel the weight of it. He brushed his thumb across her knuckles. You're not carrying it alone anymore. They spoke no vows beyond that. None were needed. As the seasons turned, so did their days. The bench was built where she said it should be. They sat there often, watching the clouds change shape and the hawks wheeling above the grass. In winter, she stitched new curtains from the muslin he'd bought. He carved her a small box for her herbs, etching her initials into the lid. They never spoke again of the man who'd tried to claim her. He was a shadow that had passed, and they had turned their faces toward the light. In time, the land grew fuller. The pasture held more calves. The garden stretched further, and their table never sat empty. She read aloud some nights, voice low and sure. He drew again, sketches of her with her hair down, her hands full of earth, her eyes steady. They grew old in that house side by side. They loved without question, fiercely and without fear. And when they looked back, it was never with sorrow, only with the quiet knowing that everything they'd built began with the fire that had warmed her back to life and the man who had chosen to keep her safe, not out of duty, but out of love. They had weathered the storm, and they had come through it together.